All right, well, welcome to the 10th and final lesson in our Kingdom Outpost study through the book of Esther. Congratulations, you've made it through the entire study. And in this last lesson, this is a short lesson, but it's a super fun one as well. In this lesson, we're going to talk about Purim, which is the feast that is set up at the end of the book of Esther to remember exactly what happened in the book of Esther. And it's set up to remind us of God's deliverance. And whenever we talk about a feast, I always just like to remind whoever I'm teaching, and you just spend a minute with your group talking about this, just how awesome it is that God in his sovereignty demanded that his people have feast and have celebrations and have special occasions. And it's of course in one regard it's just a nod to our own human limitations, that we get busy and we forget these things, and we have to have a big occasion to stop and make us remember. Of course, we do this with Thanksgiving and Christmas and all these different celebrations that we have, but in another regard, it's just a wonderful way that God set up his world, that there is so much to be celebrated. And even in the midst of brokenness, there is so much to be celebrated about the goodness of God, that he would command us to have these different feasts and celebrations. So in that regard, it's just a wonderful way to celebrate. And so we will talk through Purim a little bit, but I would encourage you to get creative with this lesson. I'll give you some ideas about how Purim is celebrated nowadays by Jews now. But yeah, just get creative with your group and have a little fun at the end of this lesson, or during this lesson, or make this whole lesson just a big Purim feast if you want to. Um, the heart of the celebration, though, we do need to remember, is remembering the story of the book of Esther. And we'll talk about in just a minute some ways that they do that. But whatever you do to celebrate, no matter what you do to have some fun, I would challenge you that at the heart of your celebration, make it be about remembering the story of Esther. So let's talk about some of the ways that Jewish people will celebrate Purim. Well, they'll have a big meal. And in fact, many people call Purim, and this is something I did not know before I started studying the book of Esther, many people will call Purim the Jewish version of Halloween. Now, before you throw things at me, let me explain a little bit about what that means. It basically means that they dress up and they share treats with one another, which kind of sounds like our American version of Halloween. And so they will bake separate, they'll bake special treats, and then they will go around in different costumes, and they'll go to each other and they will share those treats with one another. I have no earthly idea what that has to do with the book of Esther, or the story itself, but it seems like a fun thing to do, so people do it. So anyway, that's part of what they do. Some of the things that have a little bit more to do, and I mean, that'd be a cool thing to do with your group too, but some of the things that have a little bit more to do with the book of Esther, they will actually make a treat called Haman's ear and eat it. And if you just want to Google Haman's ear recipes for Purim, they're out there. And if you're a baking minded person or know somebody that is baking minded, that might be a fun thing to do to celebrate. If you're a not baking minded person, there's some other ideas here. One of the big things that they do is they will reenact the story. So they'll have some people that actually play out the different parts. They'll assign a Haman and a Mordecai and an Esther and a King Artaxerxes, and they'll give everybody different parts. And those that don't have a part, as they watch the story, they will either cheer for Esther or Mordecai, or they'll boo for Haman, or even Artaxerxes when he signs the decree or something like that. So that would be a fun thing to do with your group. If you don't have enough people, or you don't have any potential actors or actresses in your group, a lot of times they'll just read the story out loud, and they'll do the same. When Haman is introduced, they'll boo, and when Esther comes in, they'll cheer. And so that would be a fun thing to do. It's a fairly short story. You could read that pretty quickly with your group and do that. And then they also will, as it's actually mentioned in the book of Esther, they'll give gifts to the poor. And so that's another thing you could do, is you could get creative about how how you could be generous during this time, remembering God's generosity towards us. We could need to be generous to others. So that's just some ideas. I would love to see what you guys come up with in your groups. If you do any of these things, if you bake any Haman's ears, if you dress up and share treats with one another, if you reenact the story, whatever you do, if you would be kind enough to take pictures or videos and send them on over to us, we would love to see, how you celebrated ending the book of Esther. I mean, goodness, you've gone through 10 weeks with this book. You've learned a lot. I hope I've learned a lot. And this is just a time to celebrate. This is a time to thank God for his goodness and his deliverance. And so spend some time with your group just celebrating his goodness. And then, of course, I couldn't end this lesson without connecting this to the big picture story of God's redemption. This is what we've been doing now for 10 weeks, and we couldn't end it without doing the same here. And ultimately, God's story, it's so neat that he gives us these feasts along the way, but ultimately the story ends with a feast. And communion is a feast where we sit down and remember Jesus, and we remember his body broken and his blood poured out for us. But then we also, he says, I'll drink of this again when I come in my kingdom. And the story ends with a big feast at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And those verses are in the outline. You can share those with your group and read those out, and remember that God's big deliverance will come with a big, even bigger than this, even bigger than Purim feast, to remember the great things that he has done. So, tie it all together and remember God's big picture story. Hope you have some fun with this lesson. I hope you've enjoyed these lessons through the book of Esther. I have certainly learned a lot. I hope you have as well. And I just want to thank you for sticking it through to the end. And I hope you've been blessed by this.